welcome everybody to the next instalment from Paula Armstrong Ceramics. We're starting a kitchen table clay series. As you can see, I'm not in my studio, I'm at home while we isolate during the COVID-19 pandemic at the moment. So I'm going to do the videos from here. We're going to start with slab building for this next video. So I will show you all the basic techniques involved in that. I will make a small box, but then I'll show you a few other bits and pieces, a cylinder vase, that kind of thing, simpler forms. The box will give you most of the basics you need for any kind of hand building for whatever thing you want to make. So let's just get on with it. Okay, the tools you'll need for this it will be quite simple ones. I've got a pillowcase down on my table to make it porous. If you work on a non-porous surface, your clay is very likely to stick to it. So any old piece of fabric works really well, or an untreated board is fine as well, as long as it doesn't have a sealed surface. That's good. As you can see, I have a rolling pin. I've also brought my turntable so that I can use that to work on, and a board to go on top of it. Again, the turntable's not porous, so I put a wooden board on top so that things don't stick. That's my bag of clay. I've brought one of my slip pots. I've done a video about making your own slip at home. If that would be helpful to you, please just have a look in the listings, it's there. I've got circle cutters for the cylinder vase that I'm going to do. I've got my knife, rubber kidney, and a few modelling tools. I've also brought some of my impression tools and stamps home with me, so that I can put different finishes on the clay before I build with it. I'll show you that a bit later so you can see how that all works. The other thing you can use are natural items from your garden, like leaves and plants, that kind of thing. In the envelope I have some poppy seed heads that make really lovely impressions, so I'll show you those a bit later as well. Okay, let's go. Okay, slab building is exactly what it sounds like. It's building with slabs of clay. So the first thing we need to do is roll out our clay. So it's helpful if you don't have a big chunk quite like this, but I wanted to roll out enough to do all of the demonstration pieces for the video. What you need to do is easier to stand up while you roll, is roll a bit one side, and then you're going to turn it over and roll the other side. And what you need to do is to roll in different directions to try and keep it even. If you keep rolling in one direction, what quite often will happen is you'll get a wave starting. And the easiest way to get rid of that wave is to then go against it, so you would then roll that way to smooth it out. The other thing with flipping and changing your directions is when you're rolling the clay out, you're stretching one side and compressing the other. And this can lead to cracks appearing in your pieces. So by turning it over, you're kind of evening out that pressure and that process within the clay. It won't get rid of cracking completely, but it helps. Okay. So I've left this quite thick at the moment. The thicker you leave it, the easier it is to build with it, but obviously what you build is then has thicker edges to it, so it's kind of a compromise between aesthetics and practicalities with building. If you're just beginning, I suggest you leave it a little bit thicker. This is also very wet clay. We're building with wet clay. I'm not drying out as I go along. If you want really precise pieces, it might be worth looking at somebody doing a demonstration of the dryer slab method, where you can use templates, dry pieces and then put them together. It can give you much sharper, much smoother pieces. This one is, you tend to end up with very organic forms from this because the clay is a bit wetter and will take its own form to a certain degree. So we're going to start with the box. I've got my knife. Now I'm going with a cube shape this time just because it's easiest, and I'm not going to make one that's too big. So what we need is basically 6 squares. So I'm just going to do a grid. And those are our 6 squares. Now, I did that by eye, because I'm not too worried, because it's the wet clay method, about precision for this. I can alter things as I go along to fit. I also need two pieces that are slightly bigger than the others. I need the biggest square I'm going to set to one side, and that's going to be the lid for my pot. And then the next biggest piece I'm going to put onto my whirler base as the base of my pot. And then these 4 pieces will be the sides. I'm going to keep my spare pieces. I can use them to show some other techniques a bit later on. Now, before we actually start building, the other thing we need is, from one of the spare pieces, we need to just trim off 8 little strips that are about the length of each side. And we're going to use these to reinforce the joints. If they break, you just put them back together, that's fine. These don't have to be neat. You don't want them too big, otherwise your corners will disappear. Now, I'd like to put some pattern on the side, so I'm going to do that now. I've made some stamps, so I'm going to use that one, which is just lines and dots, and see what that does on these pieces. Okay, so we're going to start building the box. First thing we're going to do is we're going to use the scoring and slipping method to stick things together. So we're going to score all around the edge of the base. Now I tend to build my boxes by putting the sides on top. Some people put them to the side. Obviously allow slightly different measurements. You'll need slightly bigger sides if you put them on the outside edge rather than on top of your base. So allow a bit more clay for that. Both methods are perfectly fine. I'm not scoring over much for this, just because the clay is quite wet, so it doesn't need too much. Okay. I'm then going to score the edge of the side that's going to stick down. I'm going to put slip on both sides. Make sure you put the pattern to the outside edge. Set it in place. Now this is where the thicker clay comes in handy because it can hold itself up. At least a bit more easily. We're going to take one of the strips that we cut earlier and we're going to place it into the join on the inside. You see, I added a bit more slip just to make sure it's stuck in there. Now I tend to use the back of my nail to do this. It's helpful if you can support. I'm not doing that at the moment so that you can see what I'm doing, but if you support behind and then work, it stops the join from splitting apart on the outside of it. So try and keep this as neat as you can. This is obviously the inside of your box, so although it won't be seen that much, it will be seen. Okay. If you have any extra, as you can see I've got a bit of extra here, so we're just going to trim that extra off. There we go. Okay, now see if I can get this side to stand on its own. Okay, so for side 2 we're going to score up the side where it's going to join as well. Take the next side, score where it's going to touch. So the two sides that are going to touch. Now if you're doing a box that has a plain outside, do remember to check each of your pieces to see whether you've got a side that's slightly better than the other, so that you always put the best side to the outside of your box. There we go. And then we put this one in, like so. This will help your first side stand up, having the extra side in there. And put a bit of extra slip along the joints. And then we're going to put 2 strips, one in each joint. So these strips reinforce our joints, so wherever you have a joint it's helpful to put a strip in. If you don't want to use your fingers, you can use a tool. And to be honest, when you get around to the last side, you'll probably have to use a tool because it can be tricky to get your fingers into the joints. Just remember to kind of support behind whenever you're doing the joints. We're going to trim the excess off. Third side is the same as the second. For our final side, we need to make sure that it's going to fit. So we just trim it down. And then we score all three edges that are going to join up. And slip. Now we do exactly the same thing on each of these joins on the inside with the strips of clay. A bit of extra slip and a strip in each join. This is where the tools will come in. It's very hard to get your fingers inside the pot at this point. So a nice round ended, or you can actually use one of the ball ended tools. They work well as well. Okay, and where some of the pattern has come off on the edges, we can just use the tool to put it back on again. At this point, if you're not after a square box, you can alter the shape slightly. You can round corners in, you can push the sides out. Because this is wet clay, you can completely alter the shape depending on what you want. I quite like the idea of a nice rounded, almost basket shape, like the box has been stretched out for this one. Now, I've got a little patch there that I think needs some more pattern on. There we go. So I just stamped it back in. Edge. Just be careful when you do this that you support behind so that you don't alter the clay too much. Okay, now for your lid, there's two different ways of doing it. You need to check first of all to make sure your lid still fits. There we go. It's likely to sag slightly with the wet clay. If you don't want it to sag down slightly, you need to let it dry off a bit so that it goes a bit stronger. And then you can work with it again at that point. With the shape of my box, I don't mind it sagging down, so I'm quite happy to carry on at this point. You can either leave the lid like this, so that it sits on top, and if you want to do that, what you need to do is do a square on the inside. Leaving enough room for the thickness of the edge of the clay. So you'll score quite close to the edge. A square. The thickness of your clay, you need to allow enough for that at that edge there. And then we're going to score these pieces, pop them on here to make a square. You give them a bit of a wiggle, make sure they stick, and again trim off your excess. Make sure there's no slip around the edge here that's going to stick, and then you can place your lid on top. Like that. All the square on the inside is to stop the lid from sliding off. You can then decorate however you want. Obviously with my pot I've got lines going up on each side, so if I try and put lines on the top it's only going to go in one direction and not the other way. So I'm not going to do that with this. I think I'm going to... I'll see actually. I'm not sure what I'm going to do with it at the moment. But you can then put a handle on the top, however you'd like to do one. But literally just do your scoring, your slip, and just place any kind of handle in the top there. Make sure it's obviously well stuck down because you want to be able to lift the lid with it. If you want to put feet on, you can. Just turn your box over. But I'm also going to show you another way to do a lid. So we're going to start by actually sticking this lid on. So we're going to score all around the edges. And then all around here. Okay, you can either put this square on to the lid, or you can put the pieces around this edge here. Either way is fine, but what we're doing is putting in the joins, the strips to support the joins at this point. You can also leave it and do it when we've cut the lid off, but you need to be very careful if you do it at that point that you don't stretch the lid so that it doesn't fit. Okay, slip. Now we're going to place the lid back on and stick it in place. There we go. Okay, now we're going to blend these edges in. And I don't want sharp corners, so I'm going to get rid of my corners. A lot of your tidying up will be done when it's considerably drier as well, because you won't need to worry about altering form while you're tidying if it's a bit drier and stronger. Okay, so we've attached the top, so now we are going to take the lid off. So I'm going to mark around where I want the lid first. And when you're happy with where that is, you just cut the lid off. Okay, for the lid, we're going to try and alter the edges as little as possible, but we're going to blend these 4 strips into the edges to help reinforce the joins. Let's say these are a bit thick because we did them for the previous type of lid. Normally you would just put a little bit right near the edge and do the same blending as we've done with the rest. Normally with these boxes there's only one way for the lid to fit. to make sure, as we've just stretched things a bit, that we put them all back. Into their positions again. Match everything up. Now, ideally at this point you would leave it to dry, so that it all stays in those positions. But I'm going to just do the last part of the build. So we're going to use a few strips of clay again, about, well, between 1 centimetre and 15 millimetres deep. A couple of those a little bit wider than the others. Trim these two down. There we go. And we're just going to put these on the inside of the box so that the lid can slot down. Now that you can either put these on the inside of the box here so that they go up like that and the lid slots down on top, or the way I usually work, I tend to put them in the lid. So I just score around this edge and a couple of scores just along one half of these little strips. Slip all around. Then we're going to place strip in each side. And we're going to blend the inside edge in just to make sure they get well stuck. And do that all around each side. Okay, it doesn't have to be as high as that. It actually needs to be probably about half that. You just need enough that you can slot it in to the box. To make sure there's no slip on this again, otherwise things will stick together where you don't want them to. Dry things out a little bit. You can use a hairdryer to speed things up if you'd like to dry things out, otherwise you can just wait for them. If you want to really speed things up and you have one at home, you can use a paint stripper. Do be careful with that, obviously. It's very, very hot. Don't want to burn yourself while you're drying clay. Let's see. Let's see if we can get this to fit again. I need to find the right direction again as well. This is a very snug fit. It makes for a lovely fit when it's fired and all finished, but it does mean you have to be a little bit careful when you're putting it back together. One thing with putting a pattern on the box, I can see when things are all nicely lined up on the right sides, even if it's a very light pattern. There we go. Now, where's the dip here? So I'm just going to put that back in. And then I am going to put this little handle that I very quickly, I quite like it, so I'm going to do this as the handle. When you're attaching things like handles, this is when you need to do lots of scoring, because handles are the last thing you want falling off of a piece. So because I don't mind the dip, I can press down a bit on this. If you want it nice and smooth, like I said, let it dry a bit and then do it. Yeah, I think I'm going to leave the smooth lid for this. And just leave the texture down the outsides. Okay, now it's just the final tidy up. Before leaving it to dry. Okay. I like to do a lot of my tidying up when it's a little bit drier. And a damp sponge is very helpful when it's a bit drier. You don't want to put too much water on it at this point, as the clay is already wet. But there we go. So that is the finished box. Okay, so I'm going to show you now really quickly to do a cylinder vase, but I'm just going to go and pick some leaves and things from the garden and press them into it to show you how to do that as well. Okay, so I'll put this out the way and we'll come back with the clay that I rolled out earlier, and I'll go grab some leaves. Okay, I've just quickly run out into my garden and picked some dandelion leaves, I think, but I quite like the shape of them, so we're going to use those. I have spare pieces of clay that I had earlier, and this is just going to be a very small little vase. I've got the trim here, so I'm going to take that away so I don't have the cuts in. I'm going to make a little circle for the base. And again, pop that on my board on the turntable or whirler for the moment. Now, I quite like, I love the shape of these. I think they're lovely. Take away that edge there. So it's got the hole in the other side where I put my finger in when I was rolling it. Put a little one there. Or the big one that way. Over there, and another little one there. Like so. Although I think I might do this. That's where it's going to overlap. So I'll leave that there. I'll kind of do radiate them out a bit. There we go. Yeah, we'll see how it turns out. Okay, so we're just gonna roll. Need to find somewhere better for my box. There we go. I want this clay a little bit thinner at the same time, so I'm gonna do that as well. And I'm going to do this with a very natural clay edge, so I'm not worrying about too much tidying up. And very gently. Do be careful if you have leaves like this where they have very deep veins that go into the clay, because be aware that that's creating a thin point in your clay, which can give you a weakness when you're building. So just be aware of that. And say, if you get any bits of leaves and things left in, you can use needle tools and things to pull them out. But the other thing with it is they will just burn away in the kiln, so it's not that much of a problem. There we go. Dandelion. Okay, so we'll now bring the turntable back very carefully. Lift lightly. There we go. So first of all, we're going to score around the edge again. And then actually I'm going to trim the bottom edge of my dandelion leaf slab so I get a nice flat, smooth base. And then we're going to score that edge like that. Okay, slip. And you use the slip, you want to fill in the lines you've made. And slip around the base edge. Now, do be careful that when you put this slab on, you do get your pattern on the outside and don't wrap it on the inside. So, changed out camera angle slightly so that hopefully you can see this. So, we're just going to wrap this base. Can you see I've got a slight point there? That's actually where the dandelions, the wide part of the veins, the deep veins are. You have to try and get it so that you don't get a crease in the clay, because a cylinder shape is actually quite a strong shape as long as it's completely upright. As soon as you get a bit that bends inwards slightly, it weakens it. So you've got to try and keep the sides completely straight while you build. Although it can make some lovely natural shapes where it bulges or pushes in slightly. Now, I'm doing this so that you can see the overlap with the join in the clay, so I'm quite happy to simply score these two sides, slip, and then pop them together. This is just an old paintbrush handle that I've had for years, but it's great for doing things like this because it's quite long, which means I can get into the base and make sure everything is where it needs to be. And that's basically it. All you need to do now is tidy around the bottom edge. Make sure everything's joined. And tidy the join edge there. I'm leaving this top edge all natural. I like the way the clay cracks and makes a nice edge, so I'm leaving that. The only other thing that we should do is put a bit of extra reinforcement around the join at the bottom. So I'm just gonna cut a thin long strip and roll it into a little coil. Pop some extra slip around that bottom join. And then I'm just going to drop this in and use my tool to put it into position for me. Can be helpful if you have an overhead light for doing this, because it can be tricky to see inside the pot. Right. Any excess can just be trimmed off. And you can either use tweezers to remove, or just grab it with your knife. Okay, and then that little coil just needs to be blended into the base. Exactly the same as we did for the joins on the box. Okay, and that's that. That I forgot to do the poppy heads and show you those. So these are the poppy heads. One of my students brought them in actually and showed me how good they were. They make lovely patterns when you press them in the clay. Very star-like patterns that are quite lovely. And say, obviously it depends, each poppy head is individual. Quite like that little one there, that seems to make nice stamps. But you can do really lovely patterns with these. Press as hard or as light as you want. I think they're lovely. Hopefully you agree. Okay, so that's another one you could do for a pattern on the outside of a box or a slab built piece if you like it. Anything that you can gather around your home, your own tools. This tool does great lines, great for tree barks, that kind of textures. But any tools you have in your house can all be used for making textures. I have a great pumice stone that I use at my studio that I just collected from the beach. So, but anything around you can use for different textures as well. I might do a future video on mark making in clay just to show how that can work. So, okay, I hope you like that. I hope it helps, and I will see you again soon. Oh, now when washing your hands at home with clay, try and be careful with your home sinks and drains. Might be worth having a bucket that you just use for washing your hands while you do your clay work, because the clay can then settle to the bottom of the bucket, and you can get rid of the clean water off the top and then throw the clay away or reclaim it if you fancy doing that too. Okay, enjoy!